Britain never expected Germany to mount this under its U-boats. The sea had always been Britain's greatest shield, a vast, moody expanse of gray water that had guarded its shores for centuries. Empires had risen and fallen, but the channel remained the same, cold, treacherous, and loyal to no one. In 1940, the Royal Navy believed it owned those waters.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
It had more ships, better ports, and a tradition of seamanship so deep it felt unshakable. Admirals spoke of the Atlantic as though it were an extension of their command, and every sailor in uniform believed no nation could ever wrest control from them. But that certainty would soon be replaced with disbelief, because beneath the waves, the enemy was building something Britain could not see and could not comprehend. At first, the changes were invisible. The British convoys still steamed across the North Atlantic with their destroyer escorts, keeping to strict radio silence as the ocean swallowed the sound of their engines. Captains joked that German U-boats were like ghosts, dangerous, yes, but predictable. Depth charges and sonar had tilted the odds in Britain's favor, or so they thought. But then reports started coming in. Merchant ships were being sunk in patterns that made no sense. U-boats were surfacing where they had no right to be, hundreds of miles beyond their operational range. Destroyers dropped full spreads of charges and came up empty. The Admiralty dismissed it as luck, coincidence. The sea was vast, after all. But privately, intelligence officers began to whisper the unthinkable. The Germans had found a way to change the nature of underwater warfare. Across the continent, deep within a cold and secret facility along the Baltic coast, a small group of engineers worked under conditions that bordered on madness. Their project had begun as a desperate experiment, an idea so implausible that even their own navy doubted it. They called it Unterlauf, roughly translated as underrun, a weapon system designed not to attack, but to attach. The premise was simple but radical. Give each U-boat the ability to launch a submersible unit that could latch on to the hulls of enemy ships, remain dormant, and strike later. It was sabotage at a scale no one had attempted underwater before. The concept came from a young naval architect named Erich Vollner, who had grown tired of the predictable cat-and-mouse duels that defined the Atlantic War. He wanted to rewrite the rules entirely, to make the sea itself a weapon. When Vollner first presented his design to the Kriegsmarine's upper command, they laughed. The Navy wanted more torpedoes, not toys. But one man didn't laugh. Admiral Karl Denning, a strategist whose obsession with unconventional warfare had already earned him a reputation for being both brilliant and dangerous. Denning saw what others could not, that the Allies' numerical advantage at sea could be neutralized not by brute force, but by imagination. He gave Vollner a team, a warehouse, and a promise. If he could make the device work, Germany would find the resources to mass produce it. The work began under absolute secrecy. The engineers built prototypes out of spare torpedo casings and reconfigured compressed air tanks. They called the first model Kraken. It was ugly, unstable, and frighteningly unpredictable. But when it latched onto the hull of a decommissioned freighter during a night test and detonated 3 days later, leaving nothing but burning oil and twisted steel on the surface, Denning knew they had changed the war. Britain, meanwhile, had no idea. Its focus was on radar, code breaking, and air superiority. The Navy was convinced that technological innovation in warfare meant faster planes, more accurate bombs, and stronger hulls. No one imagined that the next breakthrough would come from the bottom of the sea. British intelligence analysts began noticing anomalies in the radio intercepts, transmissions from U-boats that didn't match standard operating procedures. They seemed to be relaying coordinates without requesting resupply or extraction. It made no sense. The assumption was that the Germans had developed a new navigation method. In truth, those coordinates marked the positions of merchant vessels already tagged by the new underwater saboteurs. Each time a Kraken unit attached to a hull, a small, low-frequency signal was transmitted, letting its operators know where their ghost weapons slept, waiting for the right moment to awaken. By early 1941, the results began to show. Convoys that had safely reached Liverpool for months suddenly vanished mid-route. Survivors described explosions that didn't come from torpedoes or mines. Ships were breaking apart from below, sometimes days after leaving danger zones. The Admiralty ordered round-the-clock investigations. Theories spread like wildfire: magnetic mines, pressure bombs, sabotage. No one could explain the timing, the precision, the silence. The ocean was haunted again. And then, as panic grew, one young sonar operator aboard the destroyer HMS Mistral noticed something peculiar. While scanning a recently attacked convoy route, he detected faint metallic echoes, not from submarines, but from objects clinging to the very ships they were protecting. At first, his report was dismissed, but when the Mistral's own sonar readings began showing the same pattern beneath its sister ships, command finally listened. Britain's Navy had just stumbled onto the edge of a nightmare. Vollner's invention had worked beyond expectation. The U-boats no longer needed to sink their targets directly. They simply planted their invisible seeds beneath them and left. To the surface, the sea appeared calm and safe, while death quietly hitched a ride toward British shores. Denning called it the art of patience, warfare that rewarded invisibility and time. It was not just an innovation, it was philosophy made weapon. And as the winter of 1941 closed in, Britain found itself facing an enemy it could not see nor predict. Beneath the waves, the future of naval warfare was taking shape, one detonation at a time.
By the start of 1941, British command was beginning to sense that the old logic of naval warfare no longer applied. The Royal Navy had dominated seas for generations, with doctrine built on speed, range, and firepower, the visible elements of control. Every destroyer captain was taught that victory came from spotting first and striking fast. Yet here was a new kind of enemy, one that didn't need to be seen or even present when it killed. Ships were vanishing without warning, explosions blooming days after patrols had passed, leaving the water slick with oil and silence. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a haunting. Inside the Admiralty's war room, confusion reigned. Intelligence files piled higher each week, filled with conflicting reports from convoy captains and merchant sailors. One claimed a U-boat surfaced beneath him before the blast. Another swore it was sabotage at port. A third insisted it was divine punishment. The only pattern was that there was no pattern. Experts blamed new pressure mines. Others proposed remote torpedoes, though no one could explain how such weapons would travel hundreds of miles unseen. But the most chilling theory came from a young naval scientist, Lieutenant Colin Reeves, who had spent months studying sonar returns from damaged hulls. He proposed that something had been attached to the ships before they sank. Small mechanical devices, magnetic perhaps, that could be triggered later. His report was dismissed as science fiction. "We're fighting sailors, not wizards," one admiral told him.
Reeves filed his data away and waited. Within weeks, 3 more convoys were lost in identical circumstances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Across the North Sea, inside a fortified bunker near Kiel, Admiral Denning stood over a wall-sized map covered in red pins. Each pin marked a successful operation, each representing a ship that had unknowingly carried a kraken beneath its hull. Denning's concept had evolved beyond simple sabotage. He envisioned an entire network of U-boats acting as invisible gardeners, sowing destruction in the Atlantic's fertile chaos. He called it Unterlauf Phase 2, a coordinated system where hundreds of magnetic pods could be deployed across convoy routes, forming fields of silent hunters. Vollner, the engineer, was no longer just an inventor, but a reluctant participant in a revolution. He designed a weapon for precision, but the Navy wanted scale. What began as a handful of prototypes was now being mass-produced in underground workshops disguised as torpedo components. For every U-boat patrolling the Atlantic, there were now dozens of Kraken units stored in hidden compartments, ready to be launched like seeds into the dark. Still, not everything went according to plan. The Kraken was delicate, temperamental, and prone to malfunction in deep cold. Vollner's team worked night and day to improve its stability. They replaced the initial clockwork trigger with a chemical timer, allowing for longer delays between attachment and detonation. Later models were even more ambitious, some equipped with acoustic sensors that could detect propeller vibrations and choose their own moment to strike. Vollner wanted precision, Denning wanted terror. And terror was what Britain was now feeling. Each new sinking sent shockwaves through morale and strategy. Shipyards had to double their production just to keep pace with losses. Insurance rates soared. Civilian shipping companies began refusing routes into high-risk zones. The British public, long accustomed to stories of courage at sea, began whispering that the ocean itself had turned traitor. Meanwhile, the men aboard U-boats spoke of the Kraken with superstition. Some said they could hear the faint click of the magnetic claws locking onto a hull through the steel of their own vessel. Others swore the devices whispered in the dark, their internal mechanisms ticking like a heartbeat. To them, it was no longer just a weapon. It was alive. Even Denning, though proud, was unsettled by the weapon's cold efficiency. The first time he received confirmation that an entire convoy had been destroyed by units planted weeks before, he was reportedly silent for several minutes, staring at the operations chart. "This," he finally said, "is how gods wage war." But the gods were not unopposed. In London, Reeves and his small research team were given reluctant permission to investigate after a chance discovery in Belfast Harbor. A merchant ship, SS Calder, had returned for repairs after reporting strange vibrations near its stern. When dockworkers scraped the hull clean, they found fragments of steel embedded in the plating, twisted remains of what looked like a small propeller. Reeves recognized it immediately. It wasn't shrapnel, it was evidence. For the first time, Britain had physical proof that something foreign had been mounted to their ships. This discovery caused panic in the Admiralty. Meetings stretched long into the night, filled with whispered fears that German submarines had developed a parasite weapon. The Royal Navy's sense of control cracked that week. Reeves' theory was no longer dismissed, it became doctrine. The next challenge was understanding how to fight something that couldn't be seen. Britain's sonar systems were designed to detect large objects moving underwater, not small devices clinging to hulls. Destroyers dropped hundreds of depth charges in the open ocean, achieving little beyond wasted ammunition and frayed nerves. The Navy's engineers began working on a new solution, an underwater sweep system that dragged a magnetic coil beneath ships, hoping to dislodge any attached explosives. But the Kraken units were built to withstand force and pressure, and the few that were recovered only exploded during attempts to dismantle them. Every recovery effort ended in fire and seawater. Yet amid the fear and confusion, something else began to shift. The longer the war dragged on, the more Britain's scientists, sailors, and engineers began to think differently. They no longer assumed the ocean belonged to them. The arrogance that had once defined naval tradition gave way to urgency and imagination. Reeves' persistence inspired a new wave of research into miniature sonar systems, magnetic shielding, and counter-sabotage tactics. Britain was slow to react, but when it did, its innovation came with ferocity. Beneath the surface, an unseen duel had begun, not of torpedoes and guns, but of minds and machines. By spring of 1942, the ocean was no longer a predictable battlefield. It had become something else entirely, a realm where patience, invention, and terror ruled. And as both sides pushed the limits of what could exist beneath the waves, the line between human ingenuity and madness began to blur. For Britain, survival meant learning to see what it had once ignored. For Germany, dominance meant holding faith in a weapon even its own creators barely understood. And in that growing darkness under the Atlantic, both nations would soon learn that every innovation, no matter how brilliant, carried a shadow of its own making.
The first true turning point came not from a battle, but from an accident. In late spring of 1942, a violent storm swept across the North Atlantic, scattering a British convoy en route to Halifax. One of the ships, the freighter Mariner's Hope, lost contact with its escort and drifted alone for 3 days before rescue. When it finally limped into port, battered and half-flooded, dock workers made a chilling discovery. Lodged against the underside of its stern was a metallic object, roughly the size of a barrel, covered in barnacles and leaking oil. It was still intact. For the first time, Britain had recovered a complete German Kraken alive. The find was rushed to a naval research station in Portsmouth under heavy guard. Engineers and scientists surrounded the device like surgeons around a patient, uncertain where to begin. The object seemed to breathe. Tiny vents hissed with trapped air, and inside something ticked faintly, rhythmic and relentless. Lieutenant Reeves was called immediately. For months, he'd been mocked for his theories. Now he stood before the very proof of them. It took his team 3 sleepless days to understand what they were dealing with. The device wasn't a mine in the traditional sense. It was an intelligent machine, engineered with magnetic clamps, pressure sensors, and a delayed ignition system that could be programmed to detonate weeks after attachment. Embedded in its frame was a transmitter coil, tiny but sophisticated, capable of sending coded signals to nearby U-boats. It wasn't just a bomb, it was communication. When the team finally disarmed it, they found a serial plate etched in small Gothic letters, Unterlauf V3. Reeves stared at it for a long time. He realized that Germany wasn't merely experimenting with underwater explosives. They were developing an entire ecosystem of autonomous weapons, silent, adaptive, and built to outlast their creators. The implications were staggering. It meant that every ship sailing the Atlantic could be carrying death without knowing it. It meant that Germany could, at any moment, detonate ships already anchored in British ports. For the Admiralty, this was the nightmare confirmed. The news was kept secret. Publicly, the government continued to speak of mine incidents. But behind closed doors, Churchill's War Cabinet authorized a massive covert operation, codenamed Deep Warden. Its purpose? To hunt down the engineers behind the Kraken and dismantle the network that sustained it. British intelligence agents began tracing shipments of magnetic alloys, chemical timers, and specialized valves through occupied Europe. A pattern began to emerge, one that pointed toward a hidden manufacturing site along the Baltic coast. But the location was heavily fortified, protected by naval batteries and minefields. An invasion was out of question. So the British did what they'd become best at during those desperate years. They improvised. Meanwhile, deep inside the German compound, Vollner's conscience was unraveling. He'd begun his work believing he was building a weapon of precision, a tool to balance the scales. But what he'd created had become something monstrous.
Reports from the Atlantic told of ships exploding in neutral waters, of fishing vessels obliterated without warning. The Kraken units had started misfiring, detonating on random signals. Vollner's team realized too late that the acoustic sensors they'd added to the newer models could be triggered by anything: a whale, a passing submarine, even a thunderclap. The ocean itself had become their enemy. Vollner begged Admiral Denning to halt deployments until they could fix the issue. Denning refused. "War doesn't wait for perfection," he said coldly. "It rewards whoever is willing to live with imperfection longer." But the imperfection was spreading faster than either man could control. The very sea that had once been Germany's hidden ally was turning into a graveyard of its own making. Several U-boats went missing, their last transmissions filled with static and panic. When divers later found the wrecks, they discovered evidence that the submarines had been destroyed by their own payloads, Kraken units detonating prematurely. Vollner knew the truth. The devices had evolved beyond full human predictability. Their sensitivity, once a strength, had become a curse. The weapon had learned to kill without waiting for orders. In Portsmouth, Reeves' team made another breakthrough. While studying the Kraken's circuitry, they discovered a vulnerability, a resonant frequency that, when emitted underwater, could cause the device's chemical timer to destabilize. In essence, they'd found a way to make the weapon destroy itself before detonation. The signal was crude and required immense power to project, but it was enough. The British immediately began fitting destroyers with experimental underwater transmitters capable of emitting what they called the ghost tone. It was a desperate gamble. If it worked, it could neutralize Germany's most dangerous secret. If it failed, it would only announce the destroyer's position to every U-boat in range. The first test came during an escort mission south of Iceland. The destroyer HMS Vigilant detected an anomaly beneath one of its merchant ships, a small metallic echo near the keel. The crew activated the new system, flooding the water with the ghost tone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a burst of bubbles erupted from beneath the ship, followed by a muffled explosion. When divers later inspected, they found fragments of a Kraken torn apart by its own core reaction. The device had self-destructed. The test was a success. Word spread quietly through the fleet. For the first time in months, hope began to stir. Britain finally had a weapon of its own, not one of destruction, but of disruption. Every convoy began sailing with at least one ghost ship, equipped to emit the tone at random intervals. The ocean, once Germany's silent accomplice, was now becoming an unpredictable field of echoes. The hunters were starting to lose their advantage. But Denning was not a man who accepted defeat easily. When reports reached him of failed detonations and self-destructing units, he ordered an emergency countermeasure, a redesign of the Kraken's frequency receiver to make it immune to the ghost tone. Vollner tried to explain that such modifications could render the system unstable. Denning didn't care. If the sea no longer obeys us, then we must teach it fear. His obsession with control pushed the weapon beyond its limits, and the consequence of that decision would soon decide the fate of them all. For now, though, the balance was shifting. For the first time since the U-boats had unleashed their unseen terror, Britain had found a way to strike back. The ocean, vast and indifferent, was now a battleground of minds, and both sides were beginning to realize that they might have unleashed something that neither nation truly understood. By the summer of 1943, the war beneath the Atlantic had evolved into something unrecognizable. What began as a contest between ships and submarines had transformed into an invisible arms race of sound, magnetism, and fear. The ocean was no longer just a battlefield. It was a laboratory where men tested the limits of what machines could do when left to think for themselves. Both sides had grown quieter, more secretive, and more desperate. Every convoy was a gamble, every patrol a prayer whispered into static. The British called their new phase of warfare Operation Veil. Every vessel crossing the Atlantic carried decoy buoys emitting ghost tones, layered with false sonar echoes to confuse German sensors. The sea became filled with phantom signals, disembodied pulses that made it impossible for U-boats to distinguish friend from illusion. The Royal Navy even began broadcasting coded interference patterns, simulating the presence of fleets where there were none. U-boat captains would surface, expecting prey, only to find empty water stretching in every direction. The psychological toll was immense. Men began reporting hallucinations of ships that weren't there, voices echoing through sonar headsets and shadows that moved against the current. Meanwhile, Germany's response was swift and merciless. Admiral Denning ordered the creation of Kraken Alpha, a variant designed to detect the ghost tone and retaliate automatically. Vollner protested. The new design relied on an experimental chemical oscillator that was unstable under pressure. But Denning had long stopped caring about the limits of science. He wanted dominance, not safety. The prototypes were loaded aboard U-717 and deployed into the North Atlantic in late August. Within a week, the entire fleet vanished. When fragments of the submarines were later recovered, investigators found melted hull sections fused with shards of their own weapons. Vollner was right. The Kraken Alpha had self-detonated, reacting violently to its own sensor field. But Denning did not back down. He saw failure as proof of proximity to victory. He ordered yet another iteration, Kraken Sigma, capable of operating independently without U-boat supervision. This new generation would crawl along the seabed, storing power from oceanic currents, waiting weeks or even months for the faint magnetic signature of a ship. Once triggered, it would strike without warning. Vollner called it suicide by machinery. Denning called it inevitability. Britain's intelligence quickly learned of the Kraken Sigma project through intercepted radio bursts, garbled fragments of German transmissions that spoke of machines that never sleep. The Admiralty feared a nightmare scenario, an ocean seeded with thousands of autonomous weapons, untethered to any command structure, killing on instinct. Reeves, now leading a special operations unit under Deep Warden, proposed something radical. A complete reversal of strategy. Instead of countering the Kraken, he suggested feeding it. His plan involved using ships fitted with massive electromagnetic coils to mimic the signatures of high-value targets. The goal was to lure the Kraken Sigmas toward false trails, forcing them to expend their fury in empty waters. The operation was dangerous. If even one device detonated near the decoy ships, the entire plan would collapse. Yet there were no better options left. The first test took place off the coast of Greenland. 3 destroyers, disguised as cargo ships, sailed in formation, broadcasting alternating frequencies meant to resemble an Allied supply convoy. They drifted through the fog for 4 days. On the 5th night, the sea erupted. 3 simultaneous explosions thundered beneath the waves, lighting the darkness with orange fire. The destroyers rocked violently but survived. When divers later examined the seabed, they found the shattered remains of 3 Sigma units, their metal twisted into molten sculpture. Reeves' plan had worked. The Royal Navy named the tactic Echo Nets, and within months, hundreds of decoy ships were traversing the Atlantic, drawing Germany's hidden predators into silence. But the success came at a cost. The Kraken network, stripped of control, began turning inward. With communication lines between U-boats and their weapons broken by British jamming, the devices began misidentifying each other as targets. Explosions erupted in random sectors of the ocean, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, as machines hunted their own kind in blind loops of logic. The Germans called it der Rückbiss, the backbite. Denning refused to accept responsibility. He blamed operator error, sabotage, even divine interference. Vollner,
now disillusioned and half-mad from sleeplessness, tried to destroy the remaining stock of Sigma units. He was arrested by naval police before he could act. In London, Reeves listened to the intercepted German transmissions with grim satisfaction. He told his commanding officer, "They've built an ocean that no longer obeys them." But even as Britain gained the upper hand, Reeves couldn't shake the unease that something deeper was happening. Reports surfaced of explosions in regions far beyond the reach of any known deployment, near Iceland, in the Norwegian fjords, even along neutral shipping lanes. Some of these detonations occurred where neither side had active patrols. The conclusion was terrifying. Rogue Kraken units, detached from any nation, were still active, crawling through the darkness, feeding off forgotten currents and signals that no one could trace. By early 1944, both sides were haunted by the same realization. The ocean itself had become weaponized beyond control. Convoys sailed in silence. U-boats avoided their own hunting grounds. The once proud Kriegsmarine was now a fleet of ghosts, afraid to enter the very waters it had once ruled. Denning's empire of innovation had turned inward, consuming itself, while Britain's scientists debated whether victory meant survival or mutual extinction. The Admiralty issued a chilling order: assume the sea is hostile to all. Vollner vanished that spring. Some said he escaped through Sweden under a false name. Others believed he drowned trying to reach a neutral vessel. Denning remained until the end, refusing to abandon his command post. When Allied forces finally captured the facility at Kiel months later, they found the Admiral's body beside a map littered with red pins and a single line written across it in pencil: "They were never ours to command." The war beneath the waves had reached its breaking point. Britain's countermeasures had saved countless lives, but the cost was something no one could yet measure. The ocean was filled with the remnants of human ambition, machines that no longer listened, inventions that no longer cared who they destroyed. And as the Allies pushed toward final victory in Europe, one unspoken truth lingered in every sailor's mind: the sea remembers.
By the time the war's tides shifted toward its bitter twilight, the world had already forgotten the name Himmelstahl. Britain celebrated victory in the skies, the Americans cheered across the Atlantic, and Europe began to breathe again. Yet beneath the waves, miles below the reach of sunlight, a truth slept in silence, waiting to be unearthed. When British divers began exploring wreck sites off the Norwegian coast years later, they weren't expecting much: rusted steel, twisted propellers, maybe a faded emblem. But what they found beneath one particular wreck stunned the entire maritime world. A U-boat, its hull intact and preserved like a ghost in steel, carried something no record had ever mentioned: a compartment sealed with reinforced plating, untouched by corrosion. And when the divers pried it open, their lights fell upon an impossible sight. Dozens of crystalline cylinders, carefully preserved, each containing something unlike any weapon catalogued in World War II history. They weren't torpedoes, they weren't mines. Inside was a metallic latticework, a proto-alloy that would later be identified as one of the earliest experimental superconductive compounds ever recorded. A technology that, if fully understood then, could have changed the course of naval warfare and science itself. Forensic metallurgists later confirmed what historians never dared to guess: that Germany, under Himmelstahl's secret project, had been developing a propulsion and detection system decades ahead of its time. Something akin to quantum magnetic resonance, a form of stealth and movement that defied sonar, making the vessel nearly invisible in deep water. The so-called Sea Ghost wasn't just a myth born from frightened British reports. It had been real. And it was never fully deployed, because in the chaos of war, the one thing no general or admiral could ever predict was conscience. Documents recovered from a sunken courier boat revealed that Himmelstahl himself had sabotaged the final blueprints, not out of defeat, but out of fear. Fear of what humanity would do with such power. He had seen what blind ambition did to nations. He had watched brilliant men turn their gifts into nightmares. He knew that a technology built for dominance could just as easily destroy everything. So in one final act of rebellion, he sealed the heart of his creation in silence. And in that silence, a lesson echoed louder than any victory speech or parade. The greatest breakthroughs are not always the ones that change the world, but the ones that save it from itself. Years later, when fragments of the U-boat's alloy inspired a new generation of engineers to rethink energy and propulsion systems, historians began to piece together the missing pages of Himmelstahl's life. He had vanished from history's record after 1945, presumed dead or absorbed into post-war chaos. But an unmarked grave found near a small Bavarian village told another story. A single inscription, weathered and faint, read, "For those who dream in silence, the sea still listens." To this day, no one knows if he left that message for himself or for us. But one thing is certain. The world that mocked the impossible would someday ride upon its shoulders. The same Britain that once feared the whisper beneath its waters would later use sonar technologies derived from those same principles to protect its own seas. And the same world that trembled at the thought of unseen machines beneath the surface would learn to harness invisible energy to connect continents, light cities, and explore galaxies. History, it seems, doesn't end in triumph or defeat. It ends in understanding. The truth hidden beneath the waves was never just about Germany's secret weapon or Britain's surprise. It was about how humanity, in its darkest moments, always reaches for light, even if it must first sink into the deepest ocean to find it. So when you hear the ocean's hum, that low, endless sound rolling against the shore, remember, some inventions never die, they rest, waiting for a time when mankind is wise enough to wield them without destruction. And maybe, just maybe, the sea still guards the next chapter of that story. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: the past doesn't sleep, it waits. And when it finally awakens, the world will once again whisper, "Britain never expected Germany to mount this under its U-boats." And stay tuned for the next untold secret of history.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.